Sufi Studies Today by William Foster. Students of movements in the Near and Middle East have during the past 3 decades turned up a wholly unexpected wealth of information on Sufism and the Sufis. This has originated with personal investigations by travellers and residents in the area, with a re-examination of traditional Sufi materials, and with an apparent desire by Sufis themselves to make available hitherto restricted information about their beliefs, practices, and working structures. 2 major results will emerge from this new information. Almost all dictionary and encyclopedia entries will have to be changed, and the emotionally religious aura that has been allowed to surround the Sufis will be lifted. Until the recent discoveries and revelations, the average Western student has had to learn about Sufism from Muslim divines' writings. Anxious to identify the undoubted prestige of Sufi thinkers with their own view of Islamic heritage, Muslim writers have emphasized the points of resemblance, often superficial, between Sufi and Islamic theological thought, and have conveniently ignored or played down the areas of Sufi thought and action that do not seem to accord with the social and psychological norms of their part of traditionalistic society. Many quasi-Sufi organizations dating from the Middle Ages until today may be said to have been taken over by theologians in the Middle East. As a result, such organizations serve mainly to condition applicants to the acceptance of Islam. In addition, the Sufis' own efforts to represent themselves as wholly compatible in their thinking with Muslim tradition has confused the issue and given Eastern and Western students alike the opportunity to identify Sufism with Islam. In Victorian times, an additional complication arose, one that is amply represented in the literature from the time and one whose ghost is still with us. This was the rise of the theory that Sufi ideas and activities, which could not be explained by reference to Muslim scripture or tradition, or which were even seen to be opposed to these, had to be regarded as fragments of shamanism, or as a reaction of the Persians against the Semitic thought patterns of the Arabs. As in almost every facile assumption of this kind, it was found possible to produce so-called evidence of these influences, which is revealed upon examination to be nothing more than proof by selected instances. The same goes for the energetic attempts to relate Sufism to various forms of Indian philosophy. This reached its apogee of absurdity when Orientalists began using Sufi-influenced Hindu theories to prove the Indian origin of Sufism. Even in more modern times, Sufism has not had an easy passage in its examination by committed scholars and others who seek to relate it to or judge it by some personal preoccupation of their own. Hence followers of Christian, Zoroastrian, Hindu, Theosophical, and other cults have from time to time tried to find affinities, resemblances, even origins for Sufism in their own sanctions. Sometimes they have attempted the reverse, to show the roots of their own beliefs to be in Sufism. Most of these efforts have failed, but they have still left their mark on the general stock of literature on the subject, to the extent that any objective student of Sufism in Eastern or Western literature may be forgiven for finding himself excessively confused by what he reads. Before he can begin to understand the materials, he has to have a thorough background in the bias of the writers, whose works are pieces of polemic just as much as sources of information. Watered-down forms of Sufism centered around an Eastern exponent or two visiting or residing in the West have added their quotas of confusion and cultishness, which have often been colored by the sectarian and universalist tendencies so often seen as alternating factors in almost all matters that appertain to the human mind. And yet, in spite of all, the sheer accumulation of information about the Sufis and their work has made it possible to steer a course through these subjectivities. Once such a course has been steered, Sufism and the individualities of the Sufi exponents emerge in a very different light from what they are represented to be. Further, and perhaps more significant, Sufism stands revealed as a series of systems with only the slightest resemblance to the mystical, religious, idealistic, or cultish organizations with which we tend automatically to bracket it. It is, in short, something on its own. It is a different kind of entity from the inevitable cults with which we are familiar. Because of this, and because of its intrinsic interest, it may well have something to contribute which could be salutary to our thinking patterns. Certainly it is to be welcomed because of its very difference. But what is Sufism? It is compatible with Islam, though it is claimed by some to have preceded Islam. Muslims and Christians alike have called it a form of Christianity, but Christ is not its central figure. Sufis themselves claim that it is something of which religion may be a misguided variety, and a diluted one at that. Sufism is a study. It is centered around a collection of people. It includes ideas and practices, and it aims at some kind of perfecting of man. Here is an illustration of the deliberate evolution theory from the 13th century Couplets of Inner Meaning by Jalaluddin Rumi, one of the greatest Sufis. He came at first into the inert world, and from minerality developed into the realm of vegetation. Years he lived thus. Then he passed into an animal state, bereft of memory of his having been vegetable, except for his attraction to spring and flowers. This was like the innate desire of the infant for the mother's breast, or the affinity of disciples for an illustrious guide. Their attraction originates with that shadow. When the shadow is no more, they know the cause of attachment to the teacher. From realm to realm man went, reaching his present reasoning, knowledgeable, robust state, forgetting earlier forms of intelligence. So too shall he pass beyond the current form of perception. There are 1,000 other forms of mind. Because of necessity, man acquires organs. So, necessitous one, increase your need. In order to develop organs of perception, Sufis have to undergo training. But this is as far as the resemblance with other systems goes, because Sufi teaching, poetry and literature, seemingly having discovered the effects of conditioning long before I.P. Pavlov, claim to be dedicated to preventing the establishment of conditioned reflexes, habit patterns, in man. Our mental set may make it difficult for us to conceive how this could be done, but the Sufis are insistent upon it, apart from those who have developed their organizations into indoctrination systems, which by reference to Sufi classics cannot genuinely be called Sufi at all. Sufis have been bracketed together with mystics of various religious persuasions, as a matter of convenience, by almost all observers. This is undoubtedly because they speak of transcendental experiences, ecstasy, discipleship, and religious formulation. But examination of Sufi groups and literature shows that Sufi organizations, teachings, and personalities alike carry on a far wider range of activities than those which we would normally recognize as mystical. There seems to be some method of procedure known to the Sufi teacher which commands the kind of training and study an individual or group should follow, and that procedure will often be found to have no easily seen relationship with mystical method or religious thinking. An analysis of the themes used by Sufi classical authors of the past 1,000 years shows that each preceptor will give instruction according to the individual needs of his disciples, not from the standpoint that all pupils are to go through a standard ceremony or course of study. It is precisely the strangeness of this approach which baffles the systematic mind. All the questions we are asking become invalidated when we say, for instance, "What is your system?" if the system is peculiar to the community in question, or "Where did you get this knowledge?" if the source is said by the teacher to be unimportant or directly acquired from another source in another modality of thought. When the foremost authority on Sufism, Idries Shah, published the Sufis, revealing the Sufi origins and usage of the Mullah Nasruddin stories, specialists in Sufism, admittedly outsiders, replied that this was not so. Yet 3 years later a Westerner, Raoul Simak, recorded a sojourn with a Pakistani Naqshbandi group, founded in the 14th century, that used nothing else but Nasruddin stories in its studies. The appearance of this piece in a distinguished religious journal, the Hibbert Journal, clinched Shah's point. But what if Simak had not been there, or had not published his record? This information problem besets most students of Sufism. To my knowledge, there is hardly a published student of Sufism who is an initiated Sufi, or who has not been inducted into some very derivative or narrowed group that would not have been regarded by classical masters as Sufi-inspired at all. Some of the most profound Sufi teaching, though translated into Western languages, is so concealed in its inner significance that nobody understands more than a distorted part of it. This is surely true of Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat, translated by Edward Fitzgerald. Professor Robert Graves and Aga Omar Ali Shah have completed a new translation of the quatrains with a Sufi interpretation. Sufi thought and activity is comparatively hard to assess and is only slowly becoming understood because the names known to researchers of avowedly Sufi literature and the organizations carrying the label are all claimed by Sufis themselves as representing only a small part of the total Sufi activity. Sufis are not secret, but their work tends to be private or iceberg-like, because they believe that for every ounce which is visible there must be a ton which is active but not perceived by the ordinary man. Non-Sufis, especially Westerners, are not accustomed to dealing with things that cannot be trotted out in front of them for instant examination. Yet it could easily be claimed that this attitude is itself based upon the presumption, which is, nothing which cannot be measured by my tools, preferably here and now, can possibly be of any account. Typical of the Sufis' claim about their work is this poem written in the 11th century by Al-Ghazali and translated into prose in 1962 by a member of the American University of Beirut. Many are the roads, but truth is a single path, and those who tread this way are few. They pass unrecognized, their goal unknown, while slowly and steadily they press along. Men do not know for what they were created, and most of them fail to see the path of truth. But there are manifestations of Sufism available for study which are becoming better known once the key is available. An example is the arabesque designs, which existed for at least 1,000 years before anyone bothered to look at them from the point of view that they might, as claimed, be special forms of diagram teaching. In 1955, Professor Rom Landau of the American Academy of Ancient Studies brought out a monograph on the arabesque. Stimulated no academic or aesthetic interest outside its ranks until the Academy of Asian Studies took up the point 600 years later. And this in spite of the fact that the Naqshbandi order is one of the most important in documented Sufi and Eastern history. Sometimes there is too much imitation and too little understanding of Sufi materials. Because of its dramatic effect, and perhaps because the Russian mystagogue Gurdjieff made some play of contact with it, the dervish dancing of the Sufis recently found its way into the West. But the fact that the supposed calisthenic and other effects of these exercises had been carefully prescribed for use only by special people and for limited purposes, not for the attunement with the infinite or for creating excitement or calm, was forgotten. In 1957, before dervish dancing was introduced into Britain and America as something of a cultish fad, a translation of a 17th century Sufi book was published in London, warning against the cultish or random use of whirling or turning. To quote, "The Kilwati have turned their ordained music and their obligatory motions which their ancient founders prescribed for a sound purpose, and which ought to be freely permitted to those worthy, into bait for the trap of imposture and a snare for disreputable fools." From The Balance of Truth by Khatib Shelebi, translated by G.L. Lewis. While Sufi practices, probably torn from context, have been introduced in the West by mystical masters rather than following the pattern of the Hindu gurus who have abounded in the United States since the 19th century, it is only in certain instances that Sufism has in the West fallen into the trap of becoming a cult. To be sure, the followers of this or that Sufi-inspired cult leader or mystical master trumpet their message as loudly as possible. But there are increasing indications that Westerners studying or practicing Sufism under more typical and genuine Sufis do not display the proselytizing or conversion syndromes. This is evidenced by the way in which they write or speak of Sufism, and also by their use of Sufi materials in their everyday work. Recent examples of Western personalities who approve of Sufism or who acknowledge being influenced by it include the novelist Doris Lessing, the actor James Coburn and his wife, the poet Ted Hughes, the late Secretary-General of the United Nations Dag Hammarskjöld, the poet Robert Graves, the historian and Orientalist John Hamilton, and the psychologist Erich Fromm. Another important result of Western analysis of traditional documents has been the discovery that many of the bewildering cults, beliefs, pieces of literature, and other unusual pieces generally supposed to be part of Christianity or of occult society provenance can be traced to Sufi origins. Hence Professor Asin Palacios has traced work by Saint Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, and Dante to Sufi published originals. The sociologist Doral has traced Rosicrucianism, much alchemy, and witchcraft to Sufi groups. The Templars and the Order of the Garter have been found to have irresistible analogies with Sufism, and much of the Hindu thinking so prized by many Westerners has been shown to be a late development of Sufi ideas imported into India and Hinduized by medieval Indian gurus. The very novelty and abundance of the newly discovered Sufi activity in the heritage of Judeo-Christian, Hindu, and Muslim traditions coming into prominence within a comparatively short space of time has caused a predictable, though unnecessary, reaction. Many people are unable to adjust sufficiently quickly to the news that Dante and the Blessed Raymond Lull copied Sufi literature, that Nijamuddin Kubra anticipated St. Francis in an alarming variety of details, or that Sufi influence underlay national, social, literary, and philosophical movements in the East and West, which until recently appeared to be of totally varying origins. The more paranoid observers either cannot stomach this new flood of information or regard it as a manifestation of some hidden Sufi hand trying to assert a psychological ascendancy. Such a reaction is as unnecessary as that of the synthesizers, who are trying to relate Sufism to their established ways of thinking. The latter include authors of books on Sufism and occultism, on Sufism and Christianity, on Sufism and poetry, and so on. The main defect in current scholarship with respect to its power to evaluate Sufism is that traditional intellectualism requires that the material studied be explicable to a form of Mandaриnism, which operates on a basis comparable to which category familiar to us does this material fall into. This approach, of course, has already been discarded by science. No scientific researcher today will say, "What kind of electricity am I studying?" without first making sure that he is working with electricity. When its materials are assembled without prejudice, Sufism displays features that seem to place it within the purview of philosophy, as well as features that apparently belong to mysticism. At the same time, it is partly manifested in literary forms, and men of literature tend to study it from this point of view, ignoring almost all others. Among the difficulties encountered in studying Sufism is the fact that as soon as one tries to analyze a Sufi organization, in terms of its rituals, ideas, manners of proceeding, hierarchy, literature, and the rest, one finds that, although complete in itself as a teaching system, the organization differs considerably from some other equally important Sufi body operating in another place, in another culture, or at another time. If we read what Sufis have to say about it, the difficulty is logically resolved. According to Sufis, their methods of teaching must vary in accordance with the individuality of the teacher, the times, the place, and the students. While such an idea may recommend itself to logic, if one grants that Sufism has knowledge to provide peculiarly apposite formulations, it does not form part of our Western intellectual tradition. Consequently, while an electronic computer might be expected to take such a contention in its stride, since it has no culturally conditioned preconceptions, most of us, as largely Western-trained thinkers, academics or otherwise, are frankly incapable of making the psychological adjustment needed to deal with this contention. It has, in short, no parallel in our thought systems. The Sufi answer is that this is precisely the thought system which we have to learn in order to be able to approach Sufism. Recent research and publications on Sufis and Sufism seem to be a particularly useful way of approaching the study of what seems to be an almost totally unfamiliar set of ideas. The alternative is to study with a Sufi exponent, and the literature, apart from that emanating from popularized and diluted cultish recruitment bodies passing as Sufi, tell us that it is hard to find Sufi teachers in the main line of the tradition. Even if one did find such an exemplar, the indications are that the majority of students would approach him in an uncritical, psychologically dependent frame of mind, or else, from the mechanical assumption point of view, they would try to relate his instruction to cultural preconceptions and fragment it in the process. As a matter of interest, the following is a contemporary Sufi document which gives insight into present-day projections of the Sufi message by authoritative exponents of the study. It is called Sufi Studies, and in stressing the need for a community within which Sufism is correctly expressed, it helps to counterbalance the increasingly theoretical tendency in students of Sufism. Sufi Studies. The kernel of the human development activity called Sufism is the basic human unit, the members who meet together and carry on the studies prescribed for them by a contemporary teacher. This is necessary to the realization which comes from being a Sufi. It may be called community, communion, meeting. It is unimportant what it is called. What is important is to see how every form of human search that later becomes a system, a religion, or an enterprise of any kind, originally depends on this coming together. It is often called the jam, coming together. Meetings for worship, teamwork of all kinds, learning in groups, all are derivations and diluted ones of this basic factor. It is the Sufis, the real Sufis, who preserve the original means of operating this jam. As time passes in ordinary communities without special safeguards, the working of this coming together becomes less and less effective, more and more formalized or generalized, until the jam no longer exists. What takes its place is social togetherness, or emotional enthusiasm, or conditioned response to being in a collection of people. No higher attainment is possible to man unless the circumstances of the coming together are correct, unless it is a communion that includes the right people at the right time, in the right place. Impatience, ignorance, sentimentality, and intellectualism tend to cause people to distort the true jam situation until it becomes something else. This essential knowledge has always existed among men and continues to exist. But superficial and other kinds of popularized thinking have obscured the real working of this coming together until people can only see innumerable forms of deteriorated jam, which they accept or reject according to whether they seem attractive, plausible, or true. It may often be impossible to reform a degenerated community. It will then be possible to regenerate it only by breaking old habit patterns and regrouping people who can really be harmonized. This reconstitution may make the teaching look very different to those who have become accustomed to a false situation. The selection of participants on the basis of their capacity and not their assumed importance always causes discontent in those who have lost the power to adapt. This lack of flexibility is, in turn, an inevitable characteristic of people and groups that have been running on automatistic patterns and that need revivifying. It is an historical fact that true communities run down and develop peculiarities that did not exist at their origin. They may do this because of the ascendancy of undesirable characteristics in the participants, or because there is a widespread tendency for groups of people to attempt to stabilize themselves, irrespective of whether this kind of stabilization loses more than it gains. This is the major reason for the cyclic emergence of living teachers. It is they alone who can restore harmony and balance in circles of individuals who have sacrificed these things in the search for continuity and stabilization. If it had been possible to attain the object in a systematized way, the means to do so would have been enunciated and recorded many thousands of years ago, just as the laws of ordinary material stability and performance are recorded and applied in physics or in applied arts. The reactions of an audience to the efforts of a real teacher to redress the balance of an organization are always predictable. They will include despair, confusion, desire for stimulation, fear that something might be taken away, rejection, desire to accept in order to profit by the new phase. Mullah Nasruddin objected to the captain of a ship tying the sails aloft during a storm, exclaiming, Can't you see that the trouble is at sea level? The teacher, however much he may regret it, can never escape the necessity of saying that it is he who has the technical knowledge, who decides whether the sails or the hull have to be tied up. If he calms the mullah by passing ropes around the hull, the ship may never reach port, even though the mullah may die during the storm in the utmost tranquillity, sure in the knowledge that his desires have been fulfilled. There are two kinds of community. The community produced and maintained by what is called today indoctrination, and the one accumulated and harmonized by starting with the right materials and the right knowledge.